Thanks for coming after lunch. We're going to have two speakers today. Patricia Breuer, who's a professor at Erasmus and made the trip yesterday for our pleasure. She recently published a paper in Science on mandatory disclosures. I urge you to read it. It's an excellent paper, and she has a number of other working papers on the topic as well. Todd Henderson, who's a visiting fellow at Hoover, a professor at Chicago. Before being a professor at Chicago, worked in the private sector, and also clerked for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The way we're going to organize it is Patricia's going to go first and talk for 12, 15 minutes, then Todd. Then we'll have a little bit of discussion back and forth. I have some questions. Hopefully we won't get to my questions, and we'll have the two experts discuss among themselves, and then I'll open it up for the last 10 minutes. Patricia, it's all yours.
Yes, so thank you very much to the conference organizers for having me and for the great opportunity to participate in this panel discussion. So as kindly introduced by Ross, I have thought about disclosure mandates and related regulations in my research, but I'm very excited also to learn more about others people's view on regulation here at this conference. And so I will start to give you my take on mandatory emissions disclosures. Transparency regulations, so regulations that require firms to disclose corporate information, be it financial or non-financial, has a long tradition. And so dating back to the early 20th century, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously stated, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant," highlighting the idea of transparency in combating corporate malpractice like fraud and also pollution. And in recent years, we've witnessed a huge increase in mandatory emissions disclosure regulations, with various countries implementing those regulations to hold firms accountable for their environmental impact. And so, for instance, the United Kingdom has mandated large firms to disclose carbon emissions since 2019, and the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will progressively require firms of certain sizes to disclose on a variety of sustainability performance-related measures. And similarly, California has passed into law 2 bills that will also require large firms operating in the state to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. And quite recently, the US SEC has also adopted climate disclosure rules for public firms. And so these transparency regulations, they are typically referred to as the third wave of environmental policies, complementing prescriptive regulation and market-based approaches like carbon taxes. And unlike the traditional regulation, transparency regulation is often viewed as less aggressive because transparency regulations, they only prescribe disclosure, but they are not going to prescribe specific actions or quantities. And with falling costs of information collection, dissemination, and aggregation over time, transparency regulation has become an increasingly popular policy tool also. And so the idea of this targeted transparency regulations is that it should enlist market forces and public pressure that should nudge companies to change their behavior in a socially desirable way by making firms' potential harmful activities public, visible. And so if this is the case, if we can shed light on companies' potential harmful activities, then mandatory disclosure could have several potential advantages. And so one way in which mandatory disclosure could help is by providing the necessary and reliable information that will help investors and also policymakers in their decision-making. A second mechanism through which mandatory emissions disclosures or mandatory disclosures in general could help is through public pressure. So by galvanizing public pressure, we could see that firms feel nudged to change their behavior. And there are some empirical studies out there that also provide some support for this public pressure mechanism. And so Pietro Bonetti, for example, from Yale Business School and his co-authors, they show that after the implementation of mandatory environmental disclosure mandates, US hydraulic fracturing operators actually reduce water pollution more in those countries where there are more local NGOs that are against fracking, and also in those counties where there are more local press coverage. So this would be consistent with the public pressure mechanism of targeted transparency. And then lastly, transparency regulation could also facilitate a cross-firm benchmarking. And this could be facilitated by providing an annual assessment of firms' own, but also of their peers' progress in reducing environmental impacts. And one study that provides some light on this specific mechanism is by Saurabh Tomar, where he shows that the mandate of the EPA to disclose greenhouse gas emissions led firms to engage in voluntary emissions reduction efforts because they were learning about where they are in comparison to their peers, and no one wants to be like the last one, so everyone would like to be a bit better, but not the last one if we have these peer comparisons. And so what we did then in a recent publication in Science with my co-authors Michael Greenstone and Christian Lloyds is to also look a bit further into this mechanism of peer benchmarking. And so we started to think about, okay, let's try to quantify firms' corporate carbon damages. And what we did here is we monetized firms' direct emissions using the social cost of carbon, so the cost of releasing an additional ton of carbon. And then we also divided this absolute monetized value by firm activity so that we can also make it more comparable across firms. And if we look at this measure of corporate carbon damages within relatively homogeneous sub-industries, so these are industries at the 8 digits level, so it's relatively homogeneous, we still see that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity across the different firms in terms of where they are with their corporate carbon damages. And so to illustrate the potential of peer benchmarking, we then ask ourselves, okay, so what would happen if those firms that are above the median of corporate carbon damages were to reduce their direct emissions that they actually align with the median of corporate carbon damages in their given sub-industry. And what we find here is that there is a substantial reduction of emissions of total corporate carbon emissions if we would use this benchmarking channel. And so we conclude that the peer benchmarking mechanism of corporate disclosure could be actually a quite meaningful way in how we could get to reductions in emissions. But so far I have been relatively, pointing out a lot of benefits about mandatory emissions disclosures. But one of these points of targeted transparency is really, do we put this on the people? Because by public pressure, we need the stakeholders to actually react. And so conditions for these stakeholders to react on corporate disclosure is first that they actually also look into the corporate disclosures and use these corporate disclosures in their decision making. And then they also need to have impact on the final position of firms, because if firms are not really affected by these stakeholders, then they are not going to care about what stakeholders are doing. And here we have also some empirical evidence that points rather in the direction that this public pressure mechanism of targeted transparency will rather have a limited effect. And so why that? Well, stakeholders have a lot of different preferences, and most of the effects that are found, they relate to households that are more wealthy or households that are more ESG conscious, but then often also effects based on their purchasing behavior. For example, if they get ESG disclosure on the products they want to buy, we also see that this is often just very short-lived. And then relatedly, in a large-scale randomized controlled field experiment, colleagues from the University of Chicago and NYU recently have looked into how retail consumers are using corporate information in their purchase decision-making. And what they find is that most of these retail consumers, they are not even aware that there is corporate information out there, especially not that there is corporate information out there on ESG information. And this is also the information that these corporate emissions disclosures would prescribe. So it's at the corporate level and not at the product level. And so seeing here that most of the retail consumers are not even aware that there is this corporate information out there, they also accordingly find that there's not a large impact on consumers' purchasing behaviors because they are not aware and they are not using this information to a large extent in their decisions. And then, of course, there are also more direct costs related to corporate disclosures. The first one being the direct cost of data collection. So not every firm will have set up a system where they can easily measure all of the specific metrics that they are asked to measure. And here also the relatively cost will be likely larger for smaller firms than for larger firms. And then one key concern with mandatory disclosure is also often that it can reveal proprietary costs. And in terms of how we can combat climate change, this is actually very important because if mandatory disclosure reveals proprietary costs, then it can actually diminish the ex-ante incentives of firms to engage in sustainability, in innovative sustainability activities. But this is actually what we would need them to do to engage in these innovative sustainability activities. Then another cost might be that ESG information, it's a multidimensional term. So we have a lot of different environmental and social metrics. And if we only look at mandatory emissions disclosures, the focus of firms will likely just go into reducing emissions, but then they allocate their attention away from other metrics, from other social and environmental metrics that might also be actually very important to care about. And finally, climate change is a global issue, and so if we only have some countries implementing disclosure rules and others not, there's always the concern that the negative environmental impacts could be just shifted from the regulated towards the unregulated markets. So basically, when we are trying to shine light on like the public firm market with transparency, what could happen is that in the end, all of the bad impact, all of the emissions are shifted to the private and transparent market. And so to conclude, so my conclusion is that mandatory emissions disclosures are not likely to work on their own, but they can help us to provide the necessary and reliable information for further climate policies that will need this information, for example, for setting taxes. It can also help us to unleash some market forces for benchmarking purposes and maybe to a more limited extent for public pressure. And so overall, the effectiveness and the net impact of mandatory emissions disclosures remains rather unclear. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to be a little bit more uplifting than Victor David Hansen was at lunch. But I am going to talk critically about the SEC's mandatory disclosure rule, which they just passed, which I think is probably one of the worst rules promulgated by the American government in its history. I really liked where Nick started our conference this morning by saying mandates can sometimes be effective. Aaron Director, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, who preceded me, said laissez-faire has nothing more than the proposition that extensions of government activity should be viewed under the presumption of error. Putting my cards on the table, that's where I am. You can convince me, not that it matters, but you can convince me that the government can play an active role, and Nick gave some examples, the Clean Air Act and acid rain. There were examples where that could be effective, but I start from the presumption that government activity is erroneous. As she suggested, this idea, and I just put a little bit of history for how we got to this fetishization with transparency. She quoted Louis Brandeis, who was, of course, one of Roosevelt's henchmen, who had this famous quote about sunlight being the best disinfectant. Of course, Roosevelt did not want to have a transparency rule. The Great Depression the stock market crashed, and for context, the stock market crashed about the same it did during the internet bubble. We didn't get a Great Depression. But the stock market crashed, and Roosevelt's elected after things didn't improve for a few years. And then this guy, Francisco Pecora, had hearings in Congress. And they put together this regulatory syllogism that there was a crash. The crash was caused the Great Depression. And the crash was caused by people did not have enough information about stock prices. And so they didn't know enough about RCA. That was the bubble stock of the era. So they bid up the price of RCA stock, and then when it crashed, that led to the Depression. So if we could just stop the inflation, the bubbles, if we gave people more information as investors, they would make better choices, asset prices would be better, and all would be right in the world. Roosevelt's first choice was something to the left in the command and control model, something like government regulation. It could be as light touch as what was called merit regulation. That is, the government would say, this is a good stock or a bad stock. This actually existed in the United States at the state level until very recently, until 1996. Famously, the Massachusetts securities regulators banned Apple Computer from selling stock in Massachusetts in 1980 because it was too speculative. And this is what Roosevelt wanted for the nation, but Joe Kennedy convinced him that this was a bad idea, and the compromise position was disclosure regulation. So I think it's just worth noting this. Another thing along the lines that Terry suggested is compared to what? And merit and disclosure regulation, as bad as it is better than what Roosevelt really wanted, which was merit regulation, which, as I suggested, is all kinds of crazy. Of course, it's important to note I'm a professor at the University of Chicago, so I'm contractually obligated to mention Milton Friedman at every talk. So here's my Milton Friedman reference. All of this stuff about how we got regulation and why we needed it was all completely wrong. He wrote this great book. It was a monetary issue. The Fed responded very badly. The money supply greatly contracted. We added on top of it tariffs, to reference something that VDH talked about at lunch. That's what led to the Great Depression, not the stock market dropping. As Gene Fama, another Chicago guy, suggested, the idea of bubbles is just an ex post thing, doesn't make a ton of sense. But notwithstanding that history, we are where we are. When we think about disclosure regulation, I think we should ask ourselves this markets versus mandates question. And the questions that I would want to know are, what information do investors want? That's the first thing. When do they want it? And in what form do they want to receive it? The SEC, when it writes rules about disclosure, is guessing at all of these things. It's a very lawyer-driven agency. They don't have a lot of economists working there. The commissioners are mostly lawyers. And they're just guessing at the answers to these questions. Now, they do ask investors. They take polls. They get comments. But investors are the ones who are giving them information about what they want, are not revealing their preferences through markets or prices. They're just responding to like polling questions. And of course, the SEC is driven largely by investors who are activist investors who are saying what they want is climate information. In the reality, I don't think that's true in large measure. Okay, did disclosure rules really change much in the 30s? Well, before the Securities Acts were passed, companies were issuing voluntary information along the lines that our prior speaker suggested about climate. There was great work by this guy, George Benstead, in the 1970s. He looked at the bid-ask spread for stocks, which is an estimate of the informational asymmetry that exists in the market. And what we wanted to see was after the stock market, the Stock Act required more disclosure, we would see a change in the bid-ask spread. It lowered informational asymmetry. We didn't see this. In other words, the information that the entire securities laws were premised on delivering to markets because of an alleged market failure, there really wasn't a market failure. So that was true of the threshold of disclosures. Since then, we have added on enormous amounts of regulatory disclosure. I went through and counted the words, or had RAs do this. the regulation SK, which is the basic disclosures that you do when you do an IPO, that's the recipe for people like me, lawyers, to write the securities disclosures. In 1980, it was the recipe, just the recipe, was 7,500 words. In 2020, it was 130,000 words. That's a 7% constant annual growth in the recipe for filling out the disclosure forms. Estimates that just filling out this information, collecting it and filling it out, is about 3 to 5% of the cost of an IPO. And that's layered on top of underwriting costs and underpricing, so a huge cost. She went through some of the costs of disclosure. Facebook last year, or Meta, their securities disclosures were 1,300 pages of 10-point font. Every disclosure in there is a lawsuit waiting to happen. This is a minefield of litigation. And that means those disclosures are going to be fly-specced by lawyers to the nth degree. It takes up a huge amount of managerial distraction and begets all kinds of costs. No economist has done an estimate of what the mandatory disclosure regime costs us, and it costs us. There are no corporations. It's shareholders, consumers, and workers, and it costs us tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars, but no one has done the cost-benefit analysis. They have to do it for individual rules, but they don't come anywhere near to capturing the cost. There have been 5,000 securities class actions, securities fraud class actions, since 1995, 5,000. Huge costs imposed, all begat by this system. And I'll just mention the distortion that she alluded to in IPOs. I was looking last night at a deck from JP Morgan. The average company is now 10 times large, the average IPO company is 10 times larger and 8 years older than they were just 10 years ago. A lot of this is driven by the fact that companies are very reluctant to go public and driven in large part by some of these costs. Okay, quick example of a disclosure gone very wrong. There was this Blood Diamond movie with Leo. Blood diamonds was the big problem of the era. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, passed the Blood Diamond Disclosure Act. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Let's just disclose about blood diamonds. And of course, they didn't realize this is going to be enormously costly. Estimates were it would cost $3 to $4 billion for companies to gear up their blood diamond disclosure, going through their supply chain and finding all these things, and then a significant cost annually. This isn't to mention the problems of litigation and all these other things. And then it turns out the eliminating blood diamonds or having these disclosures actually backfired. It increased violence in areas where there were blood diamonds because the warlords who used these things just didn't pack up shop when they ran out of blood diamonds. They started looting and murdering people to steal to fund their operations. So the unintended consequences were pretty significant. In the climate space, I don't think we're going to get this. But as she alluded to, as Peter Drucker said, what gets measured gets managed. If you tell companies you've got to disclose to your shareholders information about carbon, they will worry a lot about carbon, but not so much about other kinds of pollution. We want companies to be environmentally sensitive across all dimensions, not just about carbon. Okay, this new SEC rule briefly. The rule itself is 885 pages. The SEC's conservative estimate is this is going to take companies' disclosure costs from $4 billion a year annually to over $10 billion a year annually. So a marginal increase of $6 billion just to get this information out of companies in the form the SEC suggested. The disclosures, which I could go and talk about for a long time, are unbelievably radical. Not just how much are you polluting, but what are your plans to deal with climate change? What are your plans to deal with the reaction of the public to climate? It's going to suck up an enormous amount of managerial energy. And again, they're facing litigation from all of this. So that possibility is going to get the CEO and CFO's attention. I don't want CEOs thinking about it. I want them thinking about new products, developing new drugs, doing new technologies, not worried about disclosures. And the ones that I've talked to are very worried about the managerial distraction this is going to have on them. Already, Lots of companies are disclosing climate emission data, in part because they think people are interested in this data. It's up to over 90% of firms. So already this information in some forms is coming to the market. And what the SEC is doing is choosing exactly what the right form is for it. Here's an example from a recent paper about ESG rankings. And you can see these are companies on the y-axis and various ratings and the different rating agencies. And they give them wildly different rankings. Part of this is a potential justification for an SEC rule in that if you picked one standard, that might be good because we would avoid some of these heterogeneity. But the heterogeneity is heterogeneous for a reason. There's disputes about the right way to measure these things. So when the SEC comes into a market where people are already voluntarily disclosing a lot, there's uncertainty about exactly how to value and what value preferences to put on these things. You end up with a situation where the government is going to be choosing something and they may get it very wrong, what the sociable optimal is. She mentioned the good example of the shame causing fracking companies to reduce some effluents or whatever. But as Nick pointed out earlier, that may have unintended consequences. It may be that fracking actually is a good thing for the environment, and you can see the problem. Okay. Quickly, obviously this SEC rule only applies to public companies, not private ones. There are plenty of large private companies that have a big environmental impact. Why would we not have them disclose information? In other words, this should come from Congress, not from the SEC. The SEC is supposed to be worried about investors, not just about the public generally. That's Congress's job, not the SEC's job. Okay. I have a solution, which I'll just mention briefly to get to my 3 questions, and then I'll shut up. Again, I'm a Chicago person, so I believe in markets. How should we address the problem of what information do shareholders want? Make a market. Right now, the SEC guesses what investors want and make companies disclose it to them. What would a market look like? Well, you could have companies have the right to sell their corporate information to investors. So imagine the company is going to disclose something like its earnings or its carbon emissions, and it's going to do that at noon on Friday. They could have the right to sell that information to the market at, say, 5 minutes to noon on Friday. And people would be willing to pay for this information if it's market-moving information. And then the company would release it at noon to everybody. If you're an institutional investor, you don't want to play the risk and the information game, so you would withdraw from the market. The only people in the market in those 5 minutes would be people who are betting on that what information would happen. And companies, because they're selling information into the market, would be able to tailor that information. What do people want? When do they want it? And in what form do they want it? And optimize that as well as defray the costs that they face in generating that information. So you'd get market prices which would reflect what investors really want as opposed to asking 3 out of 5 SEC commissioners, which is what gets you an 885-page rule that's going to cost $7 billion that we all have to pay for. Okay, thank you.
So, Patricia, let me pose a couple of additional questions, and then maybe you respond or give your thoughts, and then I'll do the same to Todd. Is that okay? So, I was just at a conference, and there was a paper there about rating agencies when they first came up in the beginning of the 20th century. So before the government got involved in the rating agencies, when they were just private. And one of the things that I learned was that over the course of the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century is you get Dun & Bradstreet, you get the Moody's, you get S&P, and the antecedents competing to improve on the information that they collected and disclosed. And it's fun. You can go there if you're nerdy-like and look through the documents and you see the improvement. So then this leads to the question of, do we need the government to mandate that, or will the market? So this is following up on what Todd said. And then another story along those same lines is Lloyd Blankfein, who was the head of Goldman Sachs. And one thing he mentioned was that how much he loved regulation because it basically stymied competition because it was only by the very, very large firms that could deal with all of that. And so do you have concerns about the mandates restricting the ability of smaller firms to compete? So it's all yours.
Okay. So we've also seen in Todd's discussion that when the SEC came in to mandate the disclosure regulation, there was not a lot of any capital market effects there. But I have a bit more of a positive view on this. So I would rather say, and this is also what we've seen now with the cutback of the SEC on the now adopted mandatory disclosure rules, because before they wanted also to mandate disclosure of scope 1, 2, and 3, and now it's a big cutback where it's left to the companies actually what they are going to report, because they only have to report if emissions are material to them, so basically they can voluntarily still report what they think is best for them. And so I think the SEC or other regulators are often coming in relatively late in these mandatory disclosure rules, or also if you're looking at audit markets, there it was the same. We already had a lot of players in the market, so in the audit market there have been a lot of different private and public institutions that already looked at what are innovative ways, how can we get this market to work. And so my view is a bit more that we need all of these different institutions that work together, their interdependencies, and then most often it's just for the regulator left to, in the end, like codify like what is the best practice that now, as we have already seen, a lot of private and public institutions coming in, what is the best innovation they came up with, and that's what we are going to codify. And I think that's also more or less the SEC standpoint now, because as said, first there's now this big cutback on what they are regulating, and also they have pushed it quite out in time, especially for ESG assurance. This will only start in like 10 years or so from now, so there's a lot of time for the market actually to figure out how to do it, and then for the SEC, it's in the end just like, okay, I think this is the best way, so that's how we are going to codify it so that it's comparable across all the firms. Then with whether I'm concerned about smaller firms, I mean, I have a paper actually that also looks at financial reporting regulation and how this affects firms of different sizes. And I would say, yes, I am concerned that smaller firms typically have relatively higher costs from any disclosure regulation, and that also if these are really small firms, domestic firms, then they cannot take so much advantage also of information coming, for example, from other markets. So if we have like larger or public firms, they are also international oriented, and for them it's helpful to get a lot of financial information then about like small firms' niche markets, for example, and then they can actually get into these markets and take over the smaller firms' business activity. But then, again, referring back to mandatory emissions disclosures, so if we really want to get these disclosures to work, I think it is important that first we make them relatively simple, so by really focusing just on emissions now, even if there are some problems with just focusing on emissions, but if we just focus on emissions, just one metric to begin with, then we can have a mandate that includes more firms than if we have a mandate where we want to have a lot of different metrics measured, because this will be very hard for these smaller firms, as then the cost will be much higher for them.
So I think that the rule could have been worse is not a great defense. I mean, yes, it could have been worse. They could have had the scope 3. But we have an environmental regulator in this country that's called the Environmental Protection Agency. And that agency is staffed with experts who are experts in the environment. And I don't want car companies or whatever companies are producing things to be thinking about global warming. I want them to be thinking about the environment on net, because that's what we care about. We want a clean and healthy environment, of which potential climate change is one of the factors. So how do you trade off carbon emissions versus chemical emissions that make water dirty or mining or whatever. That's a very complicated question that 0 people in the SEC, I'm highly confident, have any sense about. So the rules should come out of the EPA about disclosure, and it should cover public companies and private companies. It should not be coming out of an agency whose job it is to be thinking about investors. One other quick thought, which is on the question of this information inside of companies and the rating agencies. Companies have dozens of large publicly traded companies have dozens of people who are in outside companies, investment companies, whose sole job it is to understand those companies. Google has 27 analysts who follow it full time. And these people make millions of dollars a year, and that's all they do is understand Google. So if it is the kind of thing that investors really demand, qua investors, these people like this would arise inside of investment companies to ferret that information out of Google. That's not what they're really focused on. They're worried about other factors. So I think there are forces that would exist absent the mandate, and I really worry that this mandate is coming from investment regulation as opposed to environmental regulation.
So just to clarify, so you're not against mandatory disclosure, either, for example, coming out of the EPA. I'll give an example. I'm looking to buy a house now. And one of the things that happens with the disclosures is quite a mandatory detailed disclosure of information about whether it's in land that would be liquefied in an earthquake, whether there's industrial sites. I mean, or is because you could come up with the argument there that a market would arise among potential buyers of property that would demand that disclosure of information, and then there would be litigation if people misrepresented it, and you wouldn't have government-mandated disclosure and enforcement. So on that dimension.
I mean, stepping back from this particular issue, I think as a society, we generally underweight the costs of disclosure. And it's not just the cost of assembling the information, it's also just the noise. If you get a disclosure that is hundreds and hundreds of pages, people do not read it. My colleague Omri Ben-Shahar has done this with the information you get when you get any kind of disclosure on the internet. And they can measure how long people read before they click and I accept. And the answer is milliseconds. No one reads this information. So there are just dozens and dozens of pages. I get pills for for some medicine that I take. It's got a pamphlet attached to it that you pull this thing off and it keeps unfurling in this micro font. I have no idea what the logic is of regulators providing me with that information, but I don't think they've fully appreciated what the costs are, in part because there might be some information that's valuable, but I would really like that piece of information and not the 600 other pieces of information. So I think that's, in general, I feel like we underweight the costs of this fetishization we have of, well, it's just disclosure. Who's against disclosure? Well, in general, I am. And I think markets would provide a lot of that. Now, you could convince me, where I started my quote at the beginning, like you could convince me, here's an example of the market systematically under-delivering a piece of information for a particularly vulnerable group, and we've done a cost-benefit analysis, and I mean, I could be convinced, but boy, I'm skeptical.
I think maybe we should throw it open to some questions. Please. Yeah, oh, sorry. You.
Bjorn, yeah. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Someone's coming.
I should have warned you so that you didn't have to be doing sprinting.
Thank you. Sorry, so it's a very simple question. You said that there was no cost estimate of the full evaluation, but didn't SEC say it would go up from, what, 4 to 10 billion? So 10 billion is the number, isn't it?
So that's the SEC's estimate of disclosure obligations for companies in general on their side is $10 billion. That does not include a ton of things. So for instance, they're not including in there, and I talked to these guys, law firms who, as part of their corporate governance practice, advise CEOs on disclosure and how they communicate with the market, and that's not part of this. And the particular guy I'm speaking of that I talked to works at a big Chicago law firm. He's got 25 people in his group that basically that's what they do, corporate governance, advising for companies. That's not part of the SEC's calculation. The litigation risk to firms from disclosing things that the anti-fraud rules and securities class actions create, that's not part of their rules. The managerial distraction of CEOs who are thinking about disclosure issues and not business issues, that's not part of their cost. I have a student of mine who started a company. They just did a C round, a pre-money valuation of $500 million. And I said to him, I have 5 shares, and I'm like, hey, when am I going to see my shekels out of this? Is it an IPO? Or you guys? He said, I would never become a public company because of the rules about what it means to be a public company. So we're waiting to get a strategic buyer. The cost of that company not IPOing, getting access to liquid capital, things more staying private, the growth of private industries in the United States is enormous. That cost not captured by the SEC. So that stuff is not in the 10 billion.
Do you have a guesstimate instead of 10 billion?
Order of magnitude higher.
So 100 billion?
Easy.
Please.
This was a very fascinating point of view that I've heard from you, Todd. So I grew up in India. It's a market that had the least regulations for stocks. People have lost money because the financial books have been cooked, right? I've also seen in Delhi where kids are opening up transistors of computers. So coming from that world to this world, I really try to think of the point that you made about why more regulation. It is to make the market more transparent for all the stakeholders, right? So I'm really not able to understand why you're finding it that hard to consider that companies should disclose. If they're already calculating their carbon emissions, why can't they just disclose it, right? I have worked on CDP report in my previous company, and I know that getting one paragraph of risk related to climate change into the risk section of the SEC 10K was a long process. And to your point about why is that long process is obviously it's right. But I guess I'm not able to reconcile the social, economic well-being benefit of these regulations versus the cost of it. And in some sense, why do the companies pay so much attention to the SEC report that they need to have such a big team? I don't know why.
Yeah, and it's a really important point you raise. If our baseline were India, from your representation, and from what I know working in some other countries that are not India, I would say we probably need more disclosure. And that would move me on my Aaron Director point to government action, because there probably is under-disclosure. The baseline that I was starting from was 1980, when all of the accounting information that you were talking about is disclosed, and the SEC's repository for this information, Edgar, is a marble. It's a public good that is enormously valuable and the envy of the world, especially when it comes to financial information, executive compensation, and I have no quibble with those disclosures. And I think, I've worked on some securities class actions on the plaintiff side, I should say, although it risks my reputation. And we sued companies in Luxembourg, and good luck getting information about CEO pay or insider trading for companies on the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. It does not exist. So they could use a little bit of the dose of what I think the SEC has done in the United States. So I agree with you if that was my baseline. Our baseline is the SEC has pushed more and more things into SEC disclosures because that is the path of least resistance. Can't get it through Congress. Can't get the EPA to promulgate these rules, so we'll just tack it into securities filings. And I think that that's my opposition, is it's like a Christmas tree, and it is now overloaded with all these political ornaments that have nothing to do with investors as investors. Your point about they should just disclose it anyway. The SEC itself admits it's going to cost companies $7 billion. So it can't just be that their rule requires them to disclose what they're already disclosing. It's going to be a significant change in the way companies do business as they approach investors with respect to the environment.
I think we have, please.
Hi, Ron Erd. I had a series of questions. One is, do you think that investors, that the SEC is there to protect investors, do you think investors have an interest in having some kind of climate disclosure to assess the risk of the business? That's like my first question. And if the answer to that is yes, then are you just saying that this rule is too much, too detailed, too much prescription of disclosure?
You want to talk about the first one? Do you think that investors?
So I think, so investors, I mean, we also see that there is demand out there, otherwise firms would not voluntarily disclose some of the environmental information we are getting, and also about climate risk. It's important for the investors because they actually can use it to better also diversify their risk and have better risk sharing. I think the more important question is whether we should only focus on investors, because in the EU, so we are more receptive to regulation anyways, I would say, but so there we have actually not the single materiality, so it's not only about the investors and the climate risk, what they do to the firm, but it's about double materiality, also what the firm is doing to the society. And so if we now have investors that can gain because now they can better do risk sharing with this information, I mean, what we could see actually is that we are just shifting around who is holding companies, but in the end, the cost of capital for these brown companies can actually go down because of this risk shifting and benefits that we are gaining. And I'm not sure that this is really what we want. So this is my take on the
Yeah, that's great. I agree. I mean, the theme of my paper I mentioned at the end was I have no idea what investors want. We should have a market that clears that information. And the way to not get the answer to that is to ask 3 out of 5 SEC commissioners, especially because the people who are feeding them information are activists who want this to be the case. And they say they buy a few shares and claim they're interested in the company and the risk to the company and so on. And it's just not true. This is a practice that has a long history in the United States. When Honeywell was making cluster bombs and napalm in Vietnam, the heir to the Pillsbury fortune bought a few shares of Honeywell and sued and tried to get Honeywell to change its practices and said, I care, I'm a shareholder of Honeywell. Well, you just bought a few shares. You're not really interested in Honeywell. You're trying to push a political agenda through share ownership. That was in the 1960s. That same kind of thing is happening with the SEC now. I'll say one pro-Europe, although it's the UK, so maybe you don't think of them as Europe. After a bunch of scandals in the early 1990s, the British formed a commission, a corporate governance commission, and because it's the British, they picked Lord Cadbury to do it. And Lord Cadbury wrote a report. He's not the egg guy. He wrote a report called the Cadbury Report, and it had a kind of brilliant regulatory approach, and that was comply or explain. So they promulgated this code, and they said, here's what we think the good governance is, but we're a bunch of bureaucrats. What do we know? Do this or explain why you're going to do something else. So that's a nice light touch regulation. So I would have liked the SEC to do this and say, look, we think you should be disclosing your carbon emissions or whatever else it is, blood diamonds, or you pick the other things. But if you don't want to, you should at least tell investors your logic. It would be too costly for us to do it. You know, it's not a risk to our business, whatever. And then let the market kind of decide in that way. So that's halfway between what they did and my market approach, which I would have been much happier with.
I think one more question. Could you make it quick?
Yeah. Can you share your thoughts about regulation capture, which is also used by some high-tech companies, monopolistic, oligopolistic, to subdue small companies?
I mean, I think she said it well. Like, it's a serious concern. I was a judge for FINRA, which is the primary regulators of stockbrokers. We face this every day. And it's a serious problem with big banks capturing the regulators to do, and of course, you can spread it along the cost of regulation along a larger asset base. So the idea that Apple and these companies are in favor of the climate disclosures does not move me at all, because of course they are, as big regulated entities. So regulation as a competitive weapon is a serious problem in the United States, and it just gets worse the bigger and bigger it gets. And I will say, you know, as somebody who's an advisor to a startup fintech company that's trying to get things through the SEC, we can't get a conversation with the right people. And if we were BlackRock, we would be having those conversations automatically. So access is another thing. And so when I see a rule come out of the SEC and I'm trying to get access to the SEC to get them to approve something I think is a good idea, and we can't even have a conversation with them, I really worry about a rule based on conversations they've had, because those are biased in favor of the established interests.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great.